As genius as Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey has proven itself to be, one aspect of the film has nagged audiences for more than 50 years, the seemingly confused and muddled final act. This was no accident. Kubrick didn't want to make it too plain to viewers what the ending of his story meant. Many people argue, however, that there isn't a proper ending to the film at all, and there are quite a few people who dislike 2001 just because they thought the ending wasn't a comprehensive finish to the film, and didn't answer many of the questions that they were asking themselves throughout each scene. There is a definitive story and ending, though, and one doesn't actually need to read Arthur C. Clarke's novel to understand it. For those of you who don't know, Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke co-wrote the screenplay for 2001 A Space Odyssey. The book does a better job explaining things such as the monolith and the Star Child and doesn't leave the reader with nearly as many hypotheticals and dead ends, but what happens in the movie can be guessed correctly before one reads Arthur C. Clarke's novel. That's exactly what I did. In order to prove that 2001 wasn't just a quote-unquote interpret-it-yourself film, as many people say it is, I developed a theory including what the monolith and the Star Child were after only watching Stanley Kubrick's film. I then read the book to see what I guessed right and what I guessed wrong. Surprisingly, I actually got the story and the meaning of the ending dead on, with only a few minor changes that the book presented. With this knowledge, I created a timeline of the entire story of 2001. Of course, if you haven't seen 2001 A Space Odyssey already, go and watch it. It is one of the best films of all time after all, so I don't want to spoil it for you. First off, we need to establish what the monolith is. Advanced beings, completely made of radiation, planted the monoliths around the universe in order to see what creatures could sustain and develop knowledge, and for one human to eventually be worthy of becoming the ultimate version of humanity. It was humanity's job then to work with what they had and possibly reach the lunar monolith. You could call this monolith a checkpoint of sorts, because it was only obtainable if the humans advanced in their knowledge enough to develop space travel. Humanity proved to have sufficient capacity for knowledge to not only travel to the moon, but to discover the monolith buried 50 feet below the lunar surface and to follow the signal it shot to Jupiter. During the mission to Jupiter, David Bowman and Frank Poole oversaw matters on the Discovery while 3 of their colleagues were in hibernation. The 2 men who remained awake did not know that their mission was to locate and scout the area where the signal beam landed on Jupiter. The beam was actually aimed at Saturn in the book, but Stanley Kubrick deviated to Jupiter because he didn't have the technology to create Saturn's rings on the screen. During the mission, the HAL 9000 unit on the Discovery mysteriously malfunctioned and became the first of its kind to do so. My first guess as to why he malfunctioned was that the monolith manipulated him in order that David Bowman would be the only living human left on board the ship. However, Arthur C. Clarke's novel gives the reason for HAL's malfunction as guilt. Because HAL knew the true nature of the mission and couldn't tell Dave or Frank, he was going against his programming and slowly becoming more aware of his lie. He was prepared, however, to finish his mission at all costs. When Dave and Frank found out about his malfunction, HAL lured Frank out to space and killed him in a panic. Dave, after much work, finally disabled HAL, but not before HAL had cut off each of the hibernating crew members' life support systems. The reason why I thought HAL did this under the influence of the monolith was because Dave became the only one left on the ship. Assuming my theory is correct, David Bowman was only able to undergo the changes he did because he was alone on the Discovery. However, the book makes it clear that HAL's actions were purely out of guilt, which means that it might have been purely coincidental that the mission worked out in David's favor. Either way, Dave became the only living thing aboard the Discovery. The ending of 2001 A Space Odyssey is very confusing. The monolith aligned with other planets and stars and seemingly plunged Dave into the Stargate. Dave then flew over strange, color-altered landscapes and finally landed in a room with human furnishings on it? Yes, that's exactly what happened. I thought at first that the room was in his head, designed to keep him busy while he was turned into the Star Child. Turns out, however, that the room in the novel was created off of the radio waves of TV shows that the monolith had captured while it was on the moon. Of course, Kubrick didn't quite go this route, so maybe it was in fact all inside Dave's head in the movie adaptation of 2001. Arthur C. Clarke's novel took a much different turn that starts around the time of HAL's malfunction. HAL was disconnected and Dave finally knew the true purpose of his mission. Mission Control called it a reconnaissance of the alien species to see their motives. Dave's destination was Saturn's moon Japetus, which had a strange, completely flat side covered with a white and shining substance. In the exact center of the white space, Dave found a 10-mile-tall version of the lunar monolith. Dave decided that he would risk his life to land on the top of the monolith and inspect it. Then, just as he had thought he was about to land, space seemed to contort, and the top of the monolith faded away to reveal a star-filled realm, the Stargate. Dave plunged in, and his speed was accelerated. After some time of traveling in the Stargate, Dave arrived at a strange and massive planet with a milky sky and black stars sprinkled among the cosmos. Here, there were many Stargate entrances and exits just like his own, implying that the creatures of radiation had planted the monoliths across the entire universe. Dave was then transported to another Stargate, which opened to a giant dull red star with a white dwarf orbiting it. Here, the powers that carried his craft protected him from the onslaught of the sun and formed what looked to be a hotel room around his ship. Dave got out to explore and found that only the titles were visible on the books scattered around the room, and every other part of them was either blurred or missing. Dave figured out that the monolith had gotten its reference for a human room from television shows it had intercepted on their way to the moon base. He also found a strange blue food that seemed to taste like whatever he wanted it to. Confused but exhausted, Dave climbed into his bed and slept, the last sleep he would ever have. As the novel describes it, Dave felt all of his memories being taken away as his life rewound and he became younger as opposed to older in Kubrick's version of the transformation. He became a fetus, aware of itself and its own identity, but of no other memories besides that. The only thing special about the fetus was that it had been made all-powerful and the ultimate version of humanity. The room around him faded away, and the Star Child traveled 20,000 light years in a moment in order to return to Earth. In the novel, Earth was surrounded by a shield of nuclear weapons, but the Star Child willed them to be gone, and so they were. Arthur C. Clarke's novel ends with the indestructible Star Child flexing his near-infinite powers and wondering how he would rule the Earth. While the novel presented a story that was more comprehensively tied together than the movie, many have been able to interpret the correct story of 2001 without having read the book, myself included. Kubrick's mission then was a success, to get people to think about what his film could mean by not implementing an obvious ending, but the story and the meaning are still there. You just have to dig a good 50 feet down to find them.